This will be your first lecture of Section 2, entitled From Hawaii to the First World War. So let's look at some of the terminology that will be important for this lecture. The first one is imperialism. Now, imperialism is a state or government's directed policy which will lead to the practice of extending its power to dominate an external region, group, or nation through military force or the threat thereof. It is often used to obtain resources critical to the primary country, and these resources can include anything from land to minerals to agricultural products or even people. Now, countries that maintain a policy of imperialism tend to later be known as or become known as a empire. Now, an empire is a collection of countries and or groups controlled by a specific person, nation, or government. Colonialism, where we can look at imperialism as being the policy, colonialism is the actual process of. Colonialism might be defined as a method used by powerful nations in order to maintain or extend their control over countries with the goal of exploiting their resources. One of the primary reasons that the United States of America is going to seek to expand its influence will be the causes or as a result of the numerous depressions and economic problems that it's facing related to its lack of markets. And we've talked about this before in previous lectures, that at a certain point, the Industrial Revolution, especially when we're talking about the Second Industrial Revolution, is creating more products than there are people. And because of this, we have an oversaturated economic market. In order to avoid the long range ramifications, which usually result in the drop in prices, which means the drop in the value of a company, more individuals are laid off. We've been through this process before. The idea with trying to expand your influence is also more predominantly focused on trying to expand your markets. And that is not only what the United States is trying to do, but many of the Western nations. They're trying to find new markets in Asia, South America, and the Middle East, and Africa in order to maintain their economies. And whoever gets a larger percentage of the market has a better chance of maintaining not only a strong economy, but a powerful economy. And although its completion or this competition existed since the 1600s, again, the Industrial Revolution is going to intensify this international contest. Whichever nation maintained the greatest global influence would control most of the world's markets. Thus, it would become an industrial, military, and social power in the world. The United States, we need to keep in mind, has lagged behind England, France, and other European countries as the Civil War has to some extent stunted its industrial growth. Now, to some extent, unlike the other Western European countries, we see that the United States has an issue of its own. This is because of the history of the United States. Should it embrace imperialism in order that it can ensure that its economy grows and also that it can assure that it will avoid any future financial crises? Or should we actually be mindful of the entire foundation by which this country was stated to have been created? What we see is that if the United States turns to an imperialistic approach or implements imperialistic policies, they're violating the American ideology and also George Washington's commitment to isolationism. These groups that kind of question American expansionism believe that the resources required to maintain the distant territorial holdings undermine the economic and social requirements of the continental United States. Now, there's also kind of a racial issue to this too, as some felt that the inclusion of such diverse racial groups would later undermine the purity of the white race in America. So we have a strong economic drive, but what we're seeing here is some people have on either end of the polar opposites ideological issues related to becoming an empire itself. Some are on the side that it's not ethical, it's not moral, that it abandons the whole cause of the United States as foundation. Also, that it tends to stretch out our resources beyond what it needs. And then, of course, on the other side, we have that white domination belief, that social Darwinistic belief, that if we start bringing in these different diverse groups from the countries that we are maintaining control over, as it's stated, will undermine the purity of the white race. When we talk about the exploration of the Pacific, we need to keep in mind that the Pacific is kind of a late development, mostly because of the fact that the conflicts in America and Europe prevented the Western governments from pursuing large-scale exploration of the Pacific. The first group of individuals that will actually come from the West into the Pacific will be, for the most part, merchants who are going to open relations with numerous islands and countries along the Pacific and within the Pacific Rim. Now, often this is without considering the flag for which their ships flew. Keep in mind that if we are talking about these whaling ships, we're talking about merchant ships. These are ships that probably spend less than a couple days every couple of years in a port within the country that they originate from. So the culture, the people on these ships do not always reflect the countries that they come from. And this is going to be a little bit of a confusing issue for a lot of the islanders in other countries that these merchants come into contact with, because they gain an understanding of these individuals thinking that these are the people of France or these are the people of the Americas. And what they find out later is that they are nothing like the true individuals who come from those countries. They don't share the same culture. Sometimes they don't even share any of the religious values. And they also do not have the same drives that either the religious groups or the governments are trying to push. So there's kind of a night and day. And for the most part, the flags really do not mean much until the governments actually become involved in not only exploration, but in expanding their influence throughout the Pacific. Now, after the War of 1812, we're going to see that Western nations begin to sponsor official missions into the Pacific region. And keep in mind that up to a point, they had been seeking the desire to maintain peace after several decades of war, if not at least 100 years of constant conflict. And after the War of 1812, they're not necessarily focused in their backyards now. They're kind of looking out into the open. Now, this isn't necessarily the same for the United States. It will have some exploration into the Pacific, but again, it's still kind of focused in its own backyard. Now, Hawaii, the islands of Hawaii, are going to benefit from this situation by ensuring good relationships with the United States, France, and England. And it's going to be kind of agreed among these countries that neither are going to really push their agenda, because all of them want equal access to the Hawaiian Islands because they are critical to their shipping and to their influence throughout Asia. So what is it about Hawaii that gains their interest? Well, it's Hawaii's location in the middle of the Pacific, as it was a great asset to merchants, whalers, and explorers. The primary chief of Hawaii, of the Big Island, was Kamehameha, and he will use this to his advantage in order to trade for guns and other Western weapons. And he'll use these weapons to gain control of all of the major islands within the Hawaiian chain. Now, once in power, King Kamehameha, who will now be known as King Kamehameha the Great, was eager to gain European support despite its effect upon his culture. This break with the Anglo-American / Native American narrative will basically end the same way, but it does not start off the same way. And it kind of gives you an understanding, again, complexity of history, but also looking at each situation, each narrative differently because they are not always the same. Yes, these are native people, but because of King Kamehameha the Great, their approach to the Europeans and to Americans is completely different than that we see with the Native Americans. However, as I stated, it's for the most part going to end the same way as it did with the Native Americans. Now, after Kamehameha's death, American missionaries sought to gain the support of the royal families, known as Ali'i, and this was to not only convert the kingdom to Christianity, but also to gain more influence. And keep in mind, there are Europeans on the islands, and all of them are competing for influence within the royal families. But it's really the American missionaries that are gaining a lot more representation among the elite. And this is going to be made possible with the help of one of Kamehameha's wives, Kahumanu. Originally, the biggest thing that attracted the Western nations to Hawaii was the fact that, as I stated before, it's kind of smack dab in the middle of the Pacific, which means it's a great place for storing supplies, if not doing repairs to your ships after they've encountered some kind of difficulty, whether it be storms or what else. However, the prospect of growing sugar and coffee, along with harvesting Hawaii's sandalwood, brought Hawaii additional economic recognition from the Western countries. As the American missionaries' influence grew, many left their religious calling to assume positions within the modernized Hawaiian monarchy and the growing agricultural industry. The men gained dual citizenship in the United States and Hawaii under the monarchy of King Kamehameha III. In 1861, the United States entered a civil war, which shifted the demand for sugar from the southern states to Hawaii. For the former missionaries, now plantation owners, they gained new power and riches through these profits. And many elite are going to start to grow angry as much of the profits remained with the Howlings or the Anglo-Americans, plantation owners. However, this does not last long. Partially, one of the major issues that we're going to see, even before we hit economic decline, is again that many of these individuals are subscribing to the concept of social Darwinism, which prevents them from seeing the islanders as equals. For the most part, the Howleys felt that the Hawaiians were racially unworthy of their sovereignty, and that the greatness that was becoming the Hawaiian Islands, one would say, was completely because of the Howleys, the former missionaries now turned influential economic leaders in the islands. With the end of the American Civil War, the sugar plantations are going to experience a massive drop in their profits as the southern states resume their sugar industries. And this is going to lead the United States government to enact tariffs against the Hawaiian sugar plantations in order to protect the southern plantations. Because note this, at this point, Hawaii is not a territory of the United States. It's an independent kingdom. And for the United States, it wants to protect its own. So it sees Hawaii, despite the fact that it is American plantation owners who control the economy there for the most part, it's still a foreign entity. So the American government's focusing on how they can help their own states. Both King Kamehameha III and the Haole plantation owners sought to sidestep the tariffs by making Hawaii a territory of the United States through the process of annexation. They felt that as a territory of the United States, that tariffs would not be possible, which was true because it is a part of the United States. That means that it is exempt from any kind of tariffs. Now, for the most part, we're going to find that they failed to find enough support in the United States and among the Hawaiian people in order to push an annexation through. And as the Haole businessmen watched their profits dwindle, they became more antagonistic towards the Hawaiian people. During the late 1800s, we're going to see that an individual by the name of Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan is going to gain international fame through his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 through 1873. He believed that a powerful navy was essential for protecting trade routes and projecting global influence. Now, his ideas resonated widely, leading to many nations, not just the United States, to invest heavily in their navies, creating a whole new level of competition among the Western nations. And this contributed to the naval arms race that will precede the First World War. Now, influenced by Mahan, the United States Navy expands from 90 small ships to over 100 combat vessels of contemporary design. Now, when we say contemporary design, we're talking about steam-powered metal warships capable of rapid deployment throughout the world. However, these kind of ships or this kind of strategy required the establishment of American bases not only in the Caribbean, but in the Pacific. And Hawaii fits that strategy perfectly because of its location, again, smack dab in the middle of the Pacific. After the death of King Kamehameha III, we see that the preceding monarchs are going to start to pull away from the United States, mainly because of the fact that they realize that they're not being treated as equals by the United States of America. And this is going to strain relations between the Hawaiian monarchy and the United States. By the time that we reach King Kalakaua, we find that he is so scatterbrained in his leadership. In one moment, he is appealing to the Americans. The next minute, he's trying to look for new backers. One minute, he is making sound financial decisions for the Hawaiian Islands, and then he's completely running it into possible bankruptcy. In that chaos, the Haole businessmen, now remember, these used to be missionaries, stage an armed revolt in January of 1893. And this, as I stated, resulted from racial, economic, social, and political tensions with the Hawaiian leadership that had existed even during the time of King Kamehameha III. Now, because of the importance of Hawaii, especially after we look at the new strategy of trying to use a stronger navy to expand your political and economic influence by Mahan, we see that it gains support, this desire to control Hawaii, from American expansionists. Now, at the front of this is the American minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens, who is going to deploy U.S. Marines from the USS Boston in order to support this rebellion. However, he's going to do this without the authorization of President Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison at this point realizes that he is very close to the end of his term. He has already lost the election, and the last thing he wants to do is implement some kind of American action when the leadership of the country is about ready to pass over to someone different. So he tells John L. Stevens to basically hold off and wait for the next president before he takes any action. The problem is that Stevens does not follow Harrison's direction, and in essence acts on his own with the support of the captain of the USS Boston. We're going to see that the USS Boston, under the direction of Stevens, is going to bring out some American Marines who are going to take up strategic locations throughout the island, one of them being right outside the Iolani Palace. Now understand, at this point, King Kalakaua has passed away, and Hawaii is now under the leadership of a woman by the name of Liliuokalani. Now, Queen Liliuokalani is a very intelligent woman who really does want to maintain relations with the Western world, more specifically the United States, but she wants Hawaii to have more independence. She is advocating for a movement known as Hawaii for the Hawaiians. Unfortunately, of course, this puts her on the opposite side of the Haole businessmen, and this is one of the reasons why they are trying to gain control over the country. Now, fearing an escalation in violence, Queen Liliuokalani is going to abdicate her throne in the hopes that the United States government would intervene on her behalf, as England had done on a previous occasion when an English commander actually invaded the Hawaiian Islands, gained control, and then the British gave the island back to the Hawaiians because he acted without their authorization. And this is, again, what she's hoping is going to happen here. Now, upon Grover Cleveland's inauguration to the presidency in 1893, Hawaii thought it had gained an ally, and to some extent it had. Unfortunately, one single individual could not come to their aid. The new president supported the Queen and ordered the return of the Hawaiian Islands to her control. However, when the American/Hawaiian businessmen refused, he thought of possibly using military force, but then became or entered into the realization that would he really want to use American troops to invade a foreign country that was now currently under the control of Americans? In essence, sending American troops to fight Americans. This definitely was not a political hot potato that he wanted to play with, so he passes the decision making over to Congress. Now, Congress basically does not want to return Liliuokalani to the throne, but at the same time, they have no desire to annex Hawaii to the United States as these American businessmen wanted, these revolutionaries had desired. And the other issue, too, is these revolutionaries were Hawaiian citizens. Remember, they have dual citizenship in both the United States and Hawaii, which means that the United States, to some extent, would be interfering with an internal struggle among Hawaiians and Hawaiians. As you can tell, this is a whole confusing mess that has various different levels and possibilities. And if you are a politician who wants to get a second term, this is clearly what we would call the third rail of politics. You just do not want to get involved in it. By the end of 1897, Hawaii remained under the control of the former missionary families as an independent republic. Elsewhere, nearly on the other side of the world, we are starting to see a situation develop in Cuba. Now, during the early 1890s, Cuban nationalists overthrew the Spanish-led government on the island. But by 1895, the Spanish troops had recaptured this island nation. Now, many in the United States, especially those who subscribe to the expansionist view, saw Cuba as a chance to expand American influence throughout the region. The Cuban liberation movement was used to gain control of the island and its resources from the Spanish. Pro-expansionist newspapers published blatantly false stories of the mistreatment of the Cuban people by Spanish troops. Now, this is going to become known as yellow journalism, and it is predominantly used by two individuals, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who are going to use these stories to boost their circulation and also to create additional support for U.S. intervention in Cuba. In the face of political opposition, the expansionist movement saw the situation in Cuba and to some extent in Hawaii as an opportunity to gain public support for their cause. The thing is, though, they needed the political power to move on their agenda. On March 4th of 1897, this would actually come into being as the presidency would pass on to Republican William McKinley. Unlike Cleveland, McKinley was a strong supporter of American expansionism throughout the world, and he had a strong desire to annex both Cuba and Hawaii as American territories. The problem is, despite all of his actions, he failed to gain the political support he needed within Congress to annex Hawaii or move on the island of Cuba. We need to understand that the process for annexation requires the establishment of a treaty. In the U.S. Constitution, in order for a treaty to be accepted, it would require two-thirds majority in the Senate. It does not involve the House. It just involves a two-thirds majority in the Senate, which he lacked at that point in time. And this was because many in Congress failed to consider Hawaii or Cuba as essential assets to American interests. It was distinguished American figures, including the author Mark Twain, the politician William Jennings Bryan, and the millionaire Andrew Carnegie, and Harvard philosopher William James, who voiced their strong opposition to American expansionism. Twain's anti-imperialism was rooted in his belief that it contradicted America's founding principles of freedom and equality. He argued that the U.S. acted against its own ideals by engaging in colonial expansion and oppression. But it wasn't just people, but also companies like the National Labor Standard and the American Sugar Trust who also opposed American expansionism, especially in Cuba and Hawaii, as it brought competition to the supermarket that they did not desire. Now, this changed with the onset of the Spanish-American War. On February 15th of 1898, the USS Maine sank in Havana Harbor after suffering a massive explosion, killing 266 sailors. Now, the American pro-expansionists blamed the Spanish for the disaster, and this would lead to increased public support for American intervention into Cuba. Now you're going to have a extra credit assignment that will open up with this lecture that is going to ask you to basically examine the possibility that maybe the pro-expansionists were wrong. I would like you to go into the internet, and when this extra credit assignment opens, you're going to use the internet to see if there was any legitimate alternative discoveries. Now this has to be discoveries, can't just be what somebody said. It has to be something that actually has some backing to it that may have called into question the cause of the USS Maine. Was it destroyed by a hostile act of the Spanish Empire? Or is there a possibility that maybe something else completely unrelated to the conflict took place on the ship? Now, the incident served as the final trigger that launched the Spanish-American War. And responding to public sentiment and concerns about the situation in Cuba, Congress passed resolutions supporting Cuban independence and authorizing the use of force. On April 11th of 1898, President McKinley requested a declaration of war against Spain from Congress. And we need to keep in mind that the act barely passed Congress on April 25th of 1898, and its passing required an agreement that the United States would not attempt to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or any control over the island after it regained its freedom, after the United States liberated it. With the battle cry of Remember the Maine, on June 10th, the U.S. Marines landed on the southeastern Cuban shore and engaged in battles at El Caney and also at San Juan Hill. We'll see the former Secretary of the Navy, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, and his Rough Riders famously play a key role in the invasion. He and his Rough Riders consisted of cowboys, miners, lawmen, and athletes that joined the military just to gain Cuba its independence. The U.S. military played a the U.S. military played a critical role in blockading the Spanish fleet from Cuba, allowing for easier movement of American troops, and eventually destroyed the Spanish fleet in battle at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Now understand, this is just the fleet, the Spanish fleet that is assigned to Cuba, because we will see another battle against the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. Now, the city of Santiago de Cuba, an important port, was captured by the American forces on July 17th, and an armistice will be signed on August 12th, bringing an end to the fighting throughout Cuba. For the most part, we're going to see that the Cuban conflict lasted no more than 10 weeks. Now, as stated earlier, the United States also moved against Spanish holdings in the Philippines to establish a presence in the Pacific and across the lucrative Chinese market. In May of 1898, the United States Pacific Fleet, under the command of George Dewey, engaged a Spanish fleet near Manila Bay in the Philippines. The modern American Steel Navy decimated the antiquated wooden Spanish warships, and the victory allowed for the US's eventual control over the Philippine Islands, which for the United States served as an additional stepping stone to the Asian markets where they could increase their sales and thus, of course, assist with our economy and reduce the possibility of saturated markets. Now, based upon the country's immediate war needs, it afforded expansionists the leverage to renew calls for Hawaii's annexation. However, in the Philippines, things weren't going very well after a while. Viewed initially as liberators from Spanish control, Filipinos welcomed U.S. troops into their country. But tensions grew as the U.S. remained despite the end of Spanish rule. The U.S. viewed the Philippines as needing American guidance and protection rather than complete independence. Does this kind of sound familiar? What we're seeing in Hawaii, what we're seeing in Cuba, and also as we're seeing here in the Philippines. Now, Filipino rebels who once fought alongside the U.S. Marines turned against what they saw as a new occupying force. And in February of 1899, Filipino insurgents attacked the American base of operations in the Filipino city of Manila. And the U.S. was compelled from that point to deploy even more troops and resources to quell this rebellion. And in what kind of becomes a reoccurring theme for the United States, the American commanders in the Philippines underestimated the Filipinos' capacity to endure great suffering for the sake of their independence. By the time the fighting slowed down by 1902, an estimated 20,000 Filipino combatants and 4,200 American soldiers had been killed in action. Estimates for civilian deaths ranged anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 due to not only combat, but disease and famine that the war brought. By 1905, the United States established a Filipino governor general to maintain the provisional government, which would always remain under the control of the United States and benefit American interests in Asia. The war sparked debate throughout the United States about the morality and practicality of imperialism, especially when we, as we talked about before, examine the original reasons that the United States broke away from England, the desire to get away from an imperialist nation, to honor its right for independent rule. And what a lot of people were seeing at this time is that the United States, to some extent, had become the England in this situation between the Philippines and the United States. Despite increased support for a naval base in Hawaii because of the Spanish-American War, the Republicans still lacked the two-thirds majority required for the Senate to ratify Hawaii's annexation. For the most part, the opposition came largely from the southern sugar companies and the groups motivated by the previously discussed concerns, which included that many people felt that imperialism, grabbing these countries to remain under American control, violated the entire foundation of America and went against why we actually declared our independence from England. Also, it went in the face of individuals who stated that we were misusing our resources towards military occupation when they should go for commercial development. And as we also discussed earlier, there was also those racial concerns by many who felt that bringing in such diverse cultures would serve in one way, shape, or form to depurify, or if not tarnish, the American white culture. Now, in response to the pro-expansionist, or to the resistance to the pro-expansionists, congressmen bypassed the standard procedures related to annexation and resorted to a joint resolution. When we talk about annexation, it's important to understand that annexation would be considered a treaty. And under the Constitution, a treaty can only be ratified by the Senate by a two-thirds majority. It does not include the House. It does not include any other body. It is, for the most part, along with the President of the United States, a two-thirds majority in the Senate. And because they could not get that, on January 7th of 1898, a resolution was passed that would allow both the House and the Senate to vote on whether or not Hawaii should be annexed, which we need to keep in mind would be a violation of the Constitution. This resulted in the Hawaiian Islands officially becoming a United States territory on February 22nd of 1900. With the United States' control over the Philippines, Hawaii's Pearl Harbor became a significant asset in maintaining U.S. military influence throughout the Pacific. So a question we need to ask is, was this process an annexation or was it an appropriation? And if so, how does this affect the United States today? I think the first question that we would need to ask was the territory, later the state of Hawaii, illegally or legally brought into the nation? Did the United States follow the Constitution when it added the island chain to the nation? If we look at the fact that it did not go through the Senate as per the Constitution, then it is very reasonable to believe that no, the islands of Hawaii were not properly annexed. They were appropriated by the United States. And if we go on that assumption, which a lot of people in Hawaii do believe that the United States illegally appropriated the islands to gain control over them and the Pacific itself, their question is then, should the United States allow the state of Hawaii to secede from the Union? Now understand, occasionally this is the same argument that we see with Texas, because like Hawaii, Texas was not brought into the Union through annexation. It was brought in through a joint resolution. It did not go through the Senate process because they faced the same problems as Hawaii. But unlike Texas, Hawaiians, especially Native Hawaiians, are very strong in their belief that the island should be allowed to secede from the Union. As a matter of fact, their case is now up in front of the World Court and at some point will be brought into the legal judgment. Frankly, as your professor and someone who comes from Hawaii, I don't know how the Hawaiian Islands will exist without the United States or how they could exist on their own. That being said, though, the magical question here is, how could or will the Hawaiian Islands actually find themselves the legal right to annex or to secede from the Union? And this is something that is being debated throughout Hawaii, the United States, and now because it's in front of the World Court throughout the world at this point. And it again shows how events that took place over 100 years ago still have relevance today. To further justify the annexation of Hawaii, pro-expansionists created a baseless accusation that the Japanese military posed a threat to U.S. interests, more specifically the Japanese Navy. And we'll find out why this became a very big issue for the Americans here in a little bit. These pro-expansionists falsely declared that the Japanese Empire wanted to use Hawaii as a point of naval operations against the United States, kind of projecting what the United States was already doing with Hawaii when it came to their attitudes or desires for Asia. And they cited that there was a large number of Japanese immigrants on the islands at that time. But keep in mind, these individuals were not sent by Japan. They were actually individuals who left Japan to find better employment, a better life in Western controlled territories like Hawaii. And they also will play upon former King David Kalakawa's attempt to get Japanese support when he was entertaining the idea of trying to become even more independent from the Western nations, more specifically the United States. Now, the US federal and state anti-Japanese legislations only added to the tense relations between the new nation or between the two nations over the following decades. And we'll see these tensions intensify throughout the early 1900s, and these tensions will definitely contribute to the outbreak of the Pacific War in 1941. So let's return to Cuba after Cuba has been freed from Spanish control. Because here we're going to see that U.S. pro-expansionist leaders broke the agreement not to interfere with Cuba's sovereignty. We're going to see that a pro-expansionist Congress is going to place new conditions upon Cuba and its interim government that tended to favor the United States' interest on the island. Through the 1901 Platt Amendment, Congress and the President denied the Cubans their sovereignty while under the United States' unilateral or self-imposed protection. The Platt Amendment called for American control over Cuban sugar plantations. It required Cuba to provide land for American military bases. It required Cuba to pay all of its debts back to the United States. And it also required that Cuba would allow the United States to intervene into any of its internal crises or internal issues in order to protect American interests within the nation. After President McKinley's assassination on September 14th of 1901, Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency. Roosevelt's foreign policy embraced the African American proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. This policy, in essence, threatened military action against any Latin American country should they challenge U.S. political and economic interests in both Central and South America. For Roosevelt, the U.S. represented an international police power. In blatant instances, this power would try to undo the wrongdoings or incompetence or impotence of the Latin American countries that had drifted away from American interests. And in essence, it reflected the popular social philosophies of social Darwinism and the white man's burden. These philosophies, we need to keep in mind, drove the imperialistic goals of the pro-expansionist government. For Theodore Roosevelt's big stick policy, it became known as the Roosevelt Corollary, which was a new interpretation that served to augment the Monroe Doctrine. Before the 1900s, a steamship traveling from the east coast of the United States to China had to sail around South America. The trip could take anywhere between 4 to 5 months. Since the 1880s, England, France, and the United States sought to build a canal that would cut through Central America, thus reducing the amount of time ships had to travel. If they were able to create this canal, it promised to shave approximately 2 months off the total journey. Whichever country controlled the canal would also gain influence throughout the region and throughout the world. The country who controlled the canal would make millions of dollars from the various countries that would use the canal. And as such, the country in control would influence foreign trade in its favor. Now, the attempts by the French and the English to complete the channel failed. And at this point, it is the United States that is trying to accomplish this task. Unfortunately for President Theodore Roosevelt, he lacked the support for the project as the Colombian government feared giving the U.S. increased power within their own country. Roosevelt encouraged Western businessmen and native Colombians associated with the canal to revolt against Colombia. On November 3rd of 1903, the USS Nashville arrived in Panama to signal American willingness to use military force, much like what we saw with the USS Boston in the American Revolution in Hawaii. Though the gunboat, a destroyer or light cruiser in modern terms, did not engage in active operations, its presence did intimidate the Colombian government. And fearing for war with the United States, Colombia allowed the secession of Panama. The new Panamanian Prime Minister granted the United States rights to the land needed for the canal. The U.S. promised to pay $10 million initially, and then $250,000 every year thereafter. The United States' control over the canal was formalized through the Hague-Bonao-Barilla Treaty. But we need to keep in mind, though the agreement between the two countries guaranteed Panama's sovereignty, the Panamanians remained fully aware of the United States' big stick policy. By 1914, the first ships sailed through the canal. Keep in mind, in 1977, the Panamanian Canal Treaties established the framework for the United States to relinquish control of the Panamanian Canal to Panama by the year 2000, which has occurred, and at this point, the United States no longer has control over the Panama Canal. We've spent some time in Cuba, spent some time in Hawaii. Let's actually start to move back towards Asia and look at the open door policy. Now, the open door policy was established by Secretary of State John Hay in 1899, and the policy aimed to secure international support for U.S. policies which promoted equal opportunity for international trade, commerce in China, and respect for China's administrative and territorial integrity. However, that's not necessarily the true focus, because the primary policy of the policy was to allow the United States greater access to the Chinese market in the face of European competition. After the Chinese Boxer Rebellion in 1900, Hay issued a second open door note to reaffirm the policy's principles. While the policy was broadly accepted in principle, it didn't entirely prevent competition and tension among the powers vying for influence in China. It did, however, shape the discourse and framework for American engagement in the region for many years to come. At a point that Western societies were feeling like they maintained control over the world, it will be the slowly growing empire of Japan that is going to throw a wrench into the Western concept of world domination. And this is because between 1904 and 1905, Russia and the Empire of Japan fought for control over Manchuria and Korea. Russia's expansion into the region, including the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, posed a threat to Japanese interests and security throughout the region. Japan is going to launch a surprise attack on Port Arthur in February of 1904, thus initiating the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. The war saw significant naval battles, including the Battle of Port Arthur, and land battles in Manchuria, resulting in Japanese, not Russian, victories. And for the most part, we will see that this will be the near total destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet. The Russians' loss represented a major upset to Western military supremacy in Asia and challenged their long-standing beliefs in Western superiority and, to some extent, social Darwinism itself. And With this, it threatened the U.S. open door policies throughout Asia. The cessation of hostilities between Japan and Russia was in part due to President Roosevelt and his negotiations which aimed to end the war. The final treaty acknowledged Japan's growing power by allowing Japan to maintain their newly gained control over Korea and Manchuria. That being said, between December of 1907 and February of 1909, Roosevelt sent a U.S. battle fleet to circumnavigate the globe on an international public relations tour. However, we need to keep in mind that the true purpose was to intimidate the Japanese Empire as it ended with a special stop in Japan's Tokyo harbor. The purpose of this circumnavigation of the globe was to demonstrate the global reach of American naval power. And we need to keep in mind that a country's navy reflects its ability to project its power and policies throughout the world and thus displays its standing within the world. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, emphasized economic investment rather than military force when it came to his foreign policy, presented a far less aggressive foreign policy, and tended to be equally effective in projecting American influence. For the most part, it increased business relations and political affairs within the Latin American countries. That being said, though, we need to keep in mind that the big stick remained in case Latin American countries interfered with these growing U.S. interests. And it also sent a stern message to the European powers to stay out of the U.S. and Latin American relations. The dollar diplomacy was also applied in China, where the U.S. sought to secure railway contracts and other investments throughout the country as they competed against Western European countries. The policy often led to resentment and instability in the targeted countries as they became reliant on American loans and subject to U.S. influence. After the term of Taft, we see the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and his beginning of Wilsonism. Now, President Wilson modified the previous policies to incorporate his ideas of American democratic moralism with an acceptance of realities, or what he believed were the acceptance of realities concerning the power of international commerce. For Wilson, he saw American economic expansion and Christian evangelicalism as keys to civilize the world. Woodrow Wilson felt that militarism represented old European political concepts that failed to relate to modern American ideology. Wilson declared that the United States, in a huge turn of policy, hoped to cultivate the friendship and confidence of the Latin American states. He emphasized that a just government must rest upon the consent of the governed. This, on the surface, appeared to be a complete 180-degree turn from the previous administrations. And the Latin American countries were delighted by the prospect of being free to conduct their own affairs without American interference. Yet, what appeared on the surface was not actually happening underneath, because Wilson's insistence on defining what was just for Latin America undermined the promises of self-determination. And this only grew in conflict as he used the U.S. military to push his agendas. And we need to keep in mind, this is going to be something quite common with Wilson. He's going to decry one thing and then do another. We'll see this here, but we'll also see this with his policies during World War I. We see this distrust for the United States in this quote, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." The Mexican Revolution emerged from the unrest among peasants, urban workers, and their mistreatment by Mexican elite class members. Very similar to what we saw in the northern East Coast industrial cities. Between 1910 and 1913, the leadership of Mexico will change 3 times. The upheaval will push more than 890,000 Mexicans into the United States. Hoping to gain influence in the country, President Wilson allied the United States with leaders friendly to his administration. Initially driven by economic and political interests, Wilson supported the regime of Porfirio Diaz, despite his coming to power through a coup. As the revolution progressed, Wilson abandoned Diaz and switched over to Francisco Madero. But later he abandoned Madero and intervened militarily. In 1914, the U.S. Navy took control of the port of Veracruz to prevent arms shipments from reaching the government of Victorino Huerta. Now, Huerta seized power after Madero's death, and in May of 1916, Mexican Revolutionary General Francisco Pancho Villa led an attack on the U.S. town of Columbus, New Mexico. 17 Americans were killed and their town center burned. This marked the first attack on U.S. territorial land since the War of 1812. The undervalued U.S. Army was sent into Mexico to pursue Pancho Villa. After a year, the U.S. withdrew without apprehending Pancho Villa. But this U.S. intervention, particularly the occupation of Veracruz, only seemed to strain relations between the United States and Mexico. The U.S. actions were seen by other countries as a violation of American sovereignty, creating a public relations problem for the United States, not just in Central and South America, but throughout the world. Between 1915 and 1916, President Wilson responded to the revolution in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic by sending in United States Marines. I don't know if you remember from the earlier points in this lecture, but remember, Wilson had stated that the use of the military reflected an old style of European dominance that violated the principles of America. Yet, as we can see, he is pretty ready to use the United States military in order to push for his policy's success. And this, again, is one of those ways that I was stating before, that his policies or his speeches tend to not match his actual actions. In 1916, Wilson adopted an old-fashioned form of imperialism by purchasing the Virgin Islands from their colonial power, Denmark, for about $25 million. The following year, Puerto Rico achieved territorial status and its residents became U.S. citizens. Woodrow Wilson failed to follow through on his rhetoric when it came to his foreign policies, as we have pointed out. Instead, he continued the long-established practices of Western nations, as his visions were ultimately hampered by political realities both at home and abroad. The progressive diplomacy of Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson differed in their approach to American foreign policies. Remember, Roosevelt, especially with his big stick policy, favored military influence. Taft favored commercial influence, while Wilson preferred political and diplomatic influence. However, all three sought the same end goal, which included American control over Latin American countries without outside influence or the interference of the people of Central and South America. They also sought the continued prominence of American economic privilege throughout the region. Additionally, their policies never truly abandoned the threat of American military force should these countries interfere with U.S. interests. And ironically, despite his rhetoric, President Wilson seemed to use the military on a far larger scale than those before him. By 1914, the United States now included among its territories and states Alaska, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, Wake Island, the American Samoas, Midway Island, Panama, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Virgin Islands, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. When we look at a lot of the images that were created during this period, especially when it came to those of the pro-expansionists, we tend to see how they saw the world in these images. If we look at this one known as Seesaw, Uncle Sam in Hawaii, the artist being Van Sant, which was published by the Evening World on November 14th of 1893. We can see how some of these political cartoons depicted the United States as a fatherly Uncle Sam, with territories considered for annexation portrayed as children, or if not very much like African Americans were drawn during the Reconstruction period, as subhuman. And we see that there are signs of the previously reviewed images of, again, that narrative of these countries being either seen as children or as subhuman to some extent, especially in this one, primate appearance. In this image, we kind of see the same thing. In this one entitled Hurrah for the 4th of July, we're coming in on Independence Day celebrations too. The artist was Charles Bartholomew, and it was published in the Minneapolis Journal on July 2nd of 1898. Now I would ask, upon reviewing this image, are these accurate depictions of the people they represented? Or does there seem, especially when it comes to Hawaii and the Philippines, a lack of acknowledgement of the two different groups, creating a stereotypical image? And we need to understand that these are very racist-minded images that portray these groups as, again, in that light of the white man's burden or social Darwinism being in need of the guidance of the United States because they themselves are not like the Western world, and especially the way they're dressed and their appearance here is looking like children needing guidance from these much older and wiser countries. In this one, we see the titled political cartoon, School Begins. It was published by Kepler and Schwartzman on January 25th of 1819. And I would ask you, look at this, and what are some of the messages that you see here? In the front row, we see the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, again, being portrayed in very primate appearances, who are looking scared and disruptive in front of their professor, Woodrow Wilson. Yes, this may be the image of Uncle Sam, but it was truly meant to be Woodrow Wilson. By the door, hiding in the back, we see the individual, the little child from China, who wants to come in but isn't allowed by American policy. If we look at the Native American, also pushed off to the side of the door, he is shown as being stupid, as being incapable of handling his own affairs as he's reading the book upside down. And if we move over to the left by the window, we see the African American child cleaning the window, but not actually being a part of the class or being a part of this system. So there we definitely have a racial comment here about African Americans, Native Americans, and those Chinese immigrants who may be in or around the United States but are not necessarily a part of the United States. And of course we have the other countries of Latin America that tend to be far more appreciative and well behaved when it comes to the United States of America. And I'd even say to some extent some of these countries that or groups that we see behind the four children of Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, as also I think in there's also some European countries all being well behaved and to some extent submissive to the United States. Here, once again, we see Woodrow Wilson in the role of Uncle Sam the Professor. This was published in Harper's Weekly on August of the 27th of 1898. Again, we see that school environment or that school deal, but in this case, we see how Hawaii and India or Puerto Rico are treated as well-behaved students, while Cuba and another South American country are seen as being disruptive and in need of discipline. So again, we can see strong influence or inferences here that the United States is the teaching the again we see the white man's burden and social Darwinism within the American Uncle Sam or Wilson, depending on how you want to look at it, and that these other nations and these other groups are in need of the education of the United States in order to be civilized. So to recap, the American policies of imperialism essentially started from the need to expand the nation's commercial markets in order to keep the economy strong. We're going to see issues of American exceptionalism and the white man's burden that will be used to justify the actions of the United States, especially in the images that we just reviewed. The drive to expand the country's influence was enhanced as the United States competed with the major European nations, driven by the same need to build their commercial markets. The actions taken by the Western nations to achieve influential dominance only served to frustrate and anger the countries that they exerted their influence on. It also called into question the true nature of Western enlightened principles towards self-governance and self-determination. The issue of racism based on social Darwinism also played a role in the United States and other Western nations' disregard for the rights of the countries that they controlled. And again, these hostilities created by the maintenance of social Darwinism will only develop in later years as these countries try to regain their self-determination and self-governance.